are some examples of cities that have quite higher price growth. Greater Jakarta is still considered as the best at the moderate range of growth. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, the government subsidy mortgage becoming the favorite for the first-time buyer to buy the house. This is relatively small, going to the small house, and hence no wonder that the housing sales at this segment is considered high. North Kalimantan, Maluku, Central Java are the big three provinces that have high sales growth on this segment. The subsidized mortgage realization was indeed keep improving since 2018, reaching 58% even during the pandemic last year. Next slide. In terms of the supply, there are several leading indicators that that have improved in property sectors occurs in Indonesia, albeit negative figure in the first quarter of 2021. We can see from the chart of rising WPI, wholesale price index, especially for the construction, steel and iron growth, and domestic cement sales. We see the improvement was partially supported by government and Bank Indonesia policies, such as Bank Indonesia has provided some incentive for the property sectors, including the 100% LTV, which was followed by the government's property tax discount. These incentives are expected to encourage consumers to buy property. Number two, the budget for Housing Finance Liquidity Facility of FLPP was increased to 12.5 trillion in 2020. Number three, the Public Works and Housing Ministry Regulation number 13/2019 on saving-based housing financing assistance has decreased the FLPP down payment for low-income people to only 1%, previously 5%. The FLPP selling price may follow the prices in 2020, as there is no policy yet on the 2021 FLPP selling price. Then the last one is high potential demand, especially from the productive age of or millennials. The number of workers, civil servants, and private or SOE employees as 25 to 35-year-old is at 10.3 million people. Next slide, please. If we take a look on the number of the construction project, the growth of highest estimation are coming from the residential and industrial, which are expected to grow by around 48% this year. Industrial growth was mainly driven by government Omnibus law that stated to support industrial estate as the base of competitiveness for manufacturing industries. Next slide, please. In terms of the location, Java Island are still the main target for the sales. There are an expectation of 56,000 new unit launched in Jakarta only. And together with West Java, Central Java, and East Java will be total at around 106,000 new property in the form of landed houses and apartments. Outside Java, of course, big cities like Medan in North Sumatra and Makassar in North Sulawesi will become the hotspot. So you can see that majority of the new property will be still coming from the Java Island. Next slide, please. To boost the property sectors, the government and Bank Indonesia launched relaxation for housing meet the criteria of number one, selling price of maximum of 5 billion rupiah. Number two, has been physically handed over during the incentive period or not pre-sales or indent. Number three, the new home or handed over in ready-to-live condition. And number four, facility given to maximum 1 unit of landed houses or apartment per one owner and cannot be resolved within a year. So while for the LTV, implied both for the first house and second house for more. Next slide. Next slide again, please. I've already discussed this. Now the big question is whether all the stimulus will have a significant impact for property sectors in the short run. For the banks, the answer is not really. Yeah. Since the probability of the property right now is on the problem for the property right now is on the demand side. Thus, if the government really boosts the demand side by containment of the COVID-19 spread and continue the stimulus, the demand is expected to stay better on the second half at the base case. In fact, the growth of home ownership through mortgage have been decreasing since 2016 and getting worse last year. Of course, we expect that this year we could see any improvement if the demand comes back. Thus, in our view, the LTV relaxation and tax-free are necessary during this time, but the demand side is sufficient to improve the pricing of the commodity of the property in this case. Next slide, please. In terms of interest rate, the environment is really supportive for the property players. We expect that Bank Indonesia will continue to manage low interest rates this year, at least until 2022. So if the Fed still manage the benchmark rate at low level, of course Bank Indonesia will follow suit. So this should continue this year as liquidity in Indonesia, most banks are still ample and hence lower the cost of fund. So this will lower the mortgage rates this year, at least, once again, at least before the interest rate cycle change as the Fed start to increase their benchmark rate in the following 2 or 3 years. Next slide. According to Indonesia's Real Estate Association, developers can supply around 300,000 to 400,000 housing units annually. This amount surely went down in 2020 due to the pandemic. Developers are estimated to hold their capex and wait for the market to normalize before adding more ready-to-sell units. On the other hand, the cumulative housing needs is increasing. According to 2019 National Socio-Economic Survey or SUSENAS, Indonesia's housing need was still high at around 12.1 million housing units. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, the backlog figure has helped the sales of the property. Compared to other 33 provinces, Jakarta has the best performance in cutting the backlog. So you can see here between 2018 to 2019, and I think continue to 2020 and 2021, Jakarta is still the province in Indonesia that successfully cutting the backlog compared to other provinces. Next slide, please. Now, on the positive side, next slide, please. Now, on the positive side, property sales in Indonesia will be supported by the millennials. As you can see the figure of the demographic in Indonesia, millennials will dominate Indonesia's population as they will reach 82 million by 2030. They have the highest preference for home ownership, but their percentage of expense for installments, including mortgage payment, is the second lowest. So I think this is the challenge in tapping the millennials for the property sectors in Indonesia. Next slide. According to two surveys, Alvara Research and the SUSENAS from the BPS, on average, at least half of the millennial families are without home ownerships. Penetration to this segment is evidently better with small and medium housing. Thus, at this point, we still believe that property will be resilient in the medium term, given to the fact that millennials will need home as they grow more mature when they have a family and stable works. Next. New developers need to consider the market demand, especially from the millennials, regarding their preference in valuing residence. As you can see from the chart, senior millennials prefer to the inner city house, while junior millennials mostly prefer to the suburban. Hence, some property developers were posted with positive figures in suburban, like if you can see in near Jakarta, in Tangerang Selatan or South Tangerang. It's the neighbor of Jakarta. Next slide, please. In terms of the age and the type of the buyer, the most resilient buyers for small and medium house are coming from the age between 31 to 40 years old, with fixed income earners as the backbones. But during the booming period, the buyers from entrepreneur or creative industries will support the sales like what we had before the pandemic. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, because this is I've explained about the purchasing power, but you can see from the numbers, the purchasing power for the affordable housing prices, for example, 124 million rupiah. They expect for the interest rate, expected annual interest rate around 7.3%, and expected annual interest rate around 13.6 million rupiah. So, like what I said before, so the purchasing power for the willingness to pay for Indonesian people, is at around 500 in the medium, 500 million. But for the lowest part, is at around 124 million rupiah. Next slide, please. Still in line with what I explained in the beginning, the loan growth of simple house was surpassing to the other type of houses with around 16% growth. Another was coming from the commercial estate. This is probably due to the needs of working capital loan. Next slide. For office supplies, there are some risks ahead from the from oversupply figure and the tendency of people starting to adjust in working from home rather than to have a spacious working place in the several business districts. This will be limit the possibility of higher return for office space outside the center Jakarta. As per third quarter of 2020, there were 10.9 million square meter office supply in Jakarta provinces, where 63% of it located in central business district, especially the two big central business district in Sudirman and also in Kuningan. The rental rate and occupancy rate was decreasing compared to last quarters. Next slide, please. Up to end 2020, there are 10.9 million square meter, like I said, of office space in Jakarta, which is around 64% of it in the central business district, from Kuningan and also Sudirman business district. Around 212,000 square meter is including in the co-working space, or around 2.1%. Next slide. There are total of 47 brand operator co-working spaces in Jakarta at end of third quarter of 2020, or growing 60% from previous year. Co-working space was still dominated by WeWork and the local brand such as CoHive, and they are the local brand with the largest share and most active in expansion. So I think going forward, the challenge for the co-working space is that people tend to prefer to working from home rather than just to using or optimizing the co-working space. Next slide. In terms of the property sector for non-office space, the growth of retail property price is relatively stagnant, while working office price has contracted in fourth quarter of 2020. Retail property price was relatively stable in the fourth quarter of 2020, while the rental price contracted deeper in minus 0.32% year-on-year. This is because of the impact of mobility limitation during the pandemic. Next slide. So this is my last slide. I just want to share to you all that the mobility plays an important role in driving people to department store or restaurant, and especially affected to the property needs. If the pandemic were gone from Indonesia and people start to mobile at least at around 60% to 70% of the pre-pandemic level, we can hope that the recovery in the retail property, like the shopping malls and the supermarket, not as long as we expect today. So thank you all. I will end my presentation here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Andry, for your presentation. And again, before we move to the next presentation by Mr. Bima, I would like to remind all of you, if you have any questions, please submit your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and we will address all your questions at the end of this presentation. With that being said, I would like to invite Mr. Bima to present your material for today. Over to you, Mr. Bima.
Thank you, Helmy, and thank you, Andry, for the very insightful presentation on the current situation of Indonesia's property sector. distinguished guests, thank you for your time. I would like to now discuss and present relating to what changes have been introduced in the Omnibus Law. I think as a general understanding, the Omnibus Law, or what we call the Job Creation Law in Indonesia, was enacted by the government with the approval of our parliament to ensure that investments are welcome into Indonesia, to ensure that many investments will arrive into Indonesia so that jobs will be created in the need to support those investments. Now, my focus today is with respect to real estate. So the agenda today will be on what are the implementing regulations relating to the real estate sector in the Omnibus Law. And among those will be those relating to land, building, and strata title, and what simplified procedures have been introduced by the government with respect to buildings and how to utilize space and land in Indonesia. And lastly, the new concept of land bank introduced by the government. Next slide, please, Mel. Next slide, please. Now, these are some of the key implementing regulations introduced after the Omnibus Law with respect to real estate. Now, the Omnibus Law itself was issued early November 2020. And in the Omnibus Law, it is stipulated that within 3 months after the enactment of the Omnibus Law, the government must issue the relevant implementing regulations. Now, this is not a small task because the Omnibus Law itself amends around 70 or 80 regulations and laws in Indonesia. So it's quite impressive that the government have been able to issue these regulations, implementing regulations, which shows the focus that has been placed by the relevant officials to ensure that the Omnibus Law can be implemented. Now, as a forewarning, I need to stress that, of course, while we already have these implementing regulations, the infrastructure itself is still in process. So not all of these procedures, can be 100% be implemented, but the government has placed certain ways on how to implement it while waiting the infrastructure to be ready. Now, what are the governmental regulations? The first ones is on changes introduced to the existing land titles in Indonesia. So this relates to the right to manage owned by the state-owned enterprises. This relates to the building rights. You may be familiar with the term HGB, the right to build, the right to cultivate HGU, and also right to use the hak pakai land title, and also strata titles. Some other changes are also introduced with respect to land registration. When can you apply for extensions, for example? There's also a new government regulation on how to settle discrepancies, which unfortunately still happens in Indonesia because of the lack of online system with respect to maps, geospatial maps, land utilization maps, and so on and so forth. The next one is the new system called Space Utilization Confirmation, that will assist investors to find out what can be done in a certain area and how to do this centrally, as opposed to having to go to the relevant institutions in the relevant districts in Indonesia. The next one is on buildings. Again, it introduces some simplification to ensure that property owners, property developers will be able to get the relevant permits in a more expeditious manner. Lastly, is a more technical. Second one is on technical requirements on housing and on apartments. Next slide, please. So these are the key highlights before I dive into these items in more detail in the next slides. First of all, on online registration, I mentioned on how there are certain changes to rights over land. Now, before the Omnibus Law was enacted, there were rumors where investors will be able to get an upfront 100 years of land concession, land rights. Everything that all investors want in Indonesia. That investors, foreigners will be able to have right of ownership, freehold land in Indonesia. Unfortunately, I can say that's not really the case, but the government still introduces methods so that investors will get some additional comfort, knowing that the initial land titles can be extended upfront, without having to wait until near expiry term of the land title. On electronic land documents, the government has finally introduced the ability of landowners to register land acquisition, to register their land ownership, to register land mortgage by way of online, electronic, as opposed to having to go to the relevant land office where the land is located to get this certificated. The next one is on strata title ownership for foreigners. We will discuss on what type of who can actually have strata title ownership of property in Indonesia in terms of foreigners. And the next one is on titles and registrations that can now be registered for underground and above ground space. So that's one side of it. How land title is important for investors. The second one is the government has actually listened to all the complaints and the uproars fair to say, by almost all investors on how it's really hard to get permits in Indonesia with respect to buildings. How it takes time to get permits with respect to buildings in Indonesia, and how it's too bureaucratic. Now, although it's fair to say that it's not really a one-day process, but actually now it's a far easier process. Most of them now can be done online, of course with the caveat that it's still waiting for readiness of the infrastructure. Okay, and if certain data, certain approvals are not given or not ready on a district or regional level, the central government can now take over. So they can push so that permits can be issued regardless of the fact that the regional government may not be ready at a certain point in time. Okay, so the next point I mentioned about space utilization confirmation. Now the last one is land bank. Now land bank is introduced by the government to respond to some complaints, some questions by investors on how can the government assist investors so that the investors can get land more easily, so that they can do away with certain issues that have been faced in trying to secure land in Indonesia. So as opposed to having the need to reach out to individual landowners, which may or may not have the relevant legal documents, a new entity called land bank is established, introduced by the government. So it's a legal entity with funds injected by the government. It also can obtain funds from third parties that will be granted the powers and titles to land in the form of right to manage. Will then be able to enter into cooperation with third parties, with investors. So it provides an alternative to investors, so that in addition to the need of having to find land on their own and contact individual owners in Indonesia, they can contact the land bank, and discuss with them on what type of land are available, what type of cooperation can be entered into, so that investors can get land ownership, land in Indonesia. Okay, although I need to note that the government regulation for land bank unfortunately has not yet been enacted. We've seen drafts of the government regulation, but for certain reasons it has not yet been enacted. But I will discuss on this issue based on the drafts that we've seen. Next slide, please. Next slide. Now, what are the changes to land titles introduced under this implementing regulation? Okay, so I mentioned earlier, how it was issued around 4 months after the Omnibus law was enacted. It actually amends and revokes quite a number of regulation. For example, we have a regulation back in 1996, which was still being used until the issuance of this new government regulation on how to explain the type of rights that investors can get in Indonesia. It's some of the provisions was really outdated, but the good thing is that now we have a new government regulation that updates these requirements. Similarly on land registration and on ownership of properties by foreigners in Indonesia. Next slide, please. So these are the key changes. The first one is on the income that needs to be paid to the land office. Now, we seem to have lost the slides. Arina, can you help perhaps? Apologies for this technical issue. Just waiting for my colleagues to assist in sliding the shares. My apologies. So I was mentioning about the fact that we have been using a 1996 law on how to explain the type of land ownership in Indonesia. Now in terms of the changes, the land rights that are available for foreigners has not changed. So we still have the fact that the freehold title, the hak milik, right to own, is still only available for Indonesian individuals. We still have the most popular land title for people who would like to build in Indonesia, the hak guna bangunan, the HGB, which is basically to build. Now, in the new regulation, there's no changes to the right to build regime. It's still available only for Indonesian entities. And Indonesian entities also means that Indonesian foreign-owned entities. So the investment vehicle that investors can establish to invest in Indonesia. Okay, in terms of validity period, the HGB also is the same. The initial validity period is for a maximum of 30 years, which can be extended for a maximum of 20 years. Which can then be renewed. But the difference now is that while this is only a technical change, the implementing regulation actually mentioned that the renewal can be given for a maximum of 30 years. Can we go to the previous slide, please? Okay, so again, similarly for cultivation, you still have the same type of land HGU. Similarly for the use of building, you still have the same type of land, which is right to use, hak pakai. Now, what has changed? Previously, in the 96 regulation, also in the 1970s regulation with respect to land registration, you can only apply for an extension or a renewal of a land title near the expiry of the land title itself. So you can only apply for an extension 2 years before it expires. Now, understandably, that has caused some anxiousness to investors, right? I only have an initial period of 30 years. Now I can only have assurance that it can be extended near its expiry. How can I not get an assurance upfront? Now, under the implementing regulation now, it is stipulated that investors, operators can already apply for an extension of a land title once the land has been utilized. So you buy your land, you buy your HGB, you have an initial period of 30 years. Once you it's ready to be operated, you have the permits, you can immediately apply for an extension for another maximum of 20 years. So in that way, after you've constructed, you have an assurance of 50 years already upfront in your land title document, without the need to wait until the term. Okay, and then the next one that is also introduced by the government to try to assist to give some comfort to the investor is the fact that once your extension period has expired, right, you still have a 2 years grace period to apply for a renewal. Previously, if you fail to do so in the last 2 years before the expiry of your land title, the land is deemed to be reverted to the state, to be returned to the state. And so with this introduction, at least you have a grace period. If for some reason the landowner forgot to renew the land title, you still have the assurance. Okay. Can we go to slide number 10, please? Yes, the previous slide. Slide 10. Page 10. Next one. Next slide. Okay, thank you. Okay, the next key change in respect to the ability to process everything online, I mentioned about this. Everything is now electronically ready, recorded at the land office. So this is a start. Ideally, this should have been done years and years ago, but at least now it's a start. Registration is done online. Now, how can this help? This helps in the issue of hopefully in the near future, where people who would like to get a confirmation on land ownership, for people who would like to get a confirmation on whether or not there is any encumbrance on the land title, these will be able to be made to be done online. Now, currently, although the land registration on an online system is already made possible, if you want to do a land search, everything still needs to be done manually.